Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us for this event. I'm Allie Miller. I use she, her pronouns. I teach on the faculty of the Schools of Public Health and Law at Yale University in the United States, and I co-direct the Global Health Justice Partnership at Yale. I'm very pleased to join you as moderator of this event. For those of you who are following earlier information on this event, I want to note that I am replacing Peggy Hicks, who was unable to join us, who was the original moderator. Peggy is the Director of Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures, and the Right to Development Division at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And while we are going to miss her terribly, I'm hoping that I'll be able to do the job. I joined this panel, however, not as a representative of the UN, but as a scholar and an activist whose work has long engaged with the importance and development of gender as a comprehensive analytic lens that allows us to do more effective human rights work across all persons. And I am interested in the way, and particularly working with the way, that gender analysis works at the intersections with race and place and age. My own work then transits both feminist and queer theory and practice and seeks to build bridges between and among movements using gender lenses. With this introduction, I need to say a few words about the logistics of today. I would like to tell you that our meeting is being held in English with French and Spanish interpretation. To be able to listen to the meeting, you will need to select which language you prefer. At the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see the image of a globe at the right lower bar of your screen, and you can select French, English, or Spanish as your language. I will now let the French interpreter join us to explain how this will work. We will be joined shortly by the Spanish language interpreter as they are able to connect. We're having some technical difficulties. So first, the French interpreter. Okay, thank you. So as we proceed, I'd like to also note that the event is being live streamed in English only to the Facebook page of the Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. If you require captioning, we advise you to follow the event on Facebook, as there is a feature that auto-generates the captions. Just look for the Independent Expert SOGI page on Facebook. We would like to call out, however, that these captions are not always as accurate as we might like. Today's event is being recorded and will remain available on the mandate's social media page. Audio and video captured during this meeting may be used later for dissemination purposes. If you would prefer, you are welcome to engage in the discussions here today anonymously. So these are the different modes of social media communication. I would like to start discussing some of the key issues with our panel, but you can begin now to send in your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom or through the comment section on Facebook. There is a team supporting the moderation and screening the questions to ensure that they do not contain hate speech. Messages that do not comply with these guidelines will not be made public to the audience. You can send in your questions in English, French, or Spanish. Finally, I want to highlight that this meeting is being supported by the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School. This is where Mr. Madrigal-Borloz is the Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher. The Human Rights Program at Harvard is providing the platform and the logistical support for us to meet today, and we are very, very grateful to them. Additionally, we have the support of two other organizations who are providing our language accessibility. For French, we have EGID, a new international Francophone alliance for equality and diversities. And for Spanish, we are supported by the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Many thanks to these partners for providing strategic support for this event. And after these housekeeping items, we are now set to start. Please begin. We are about to begin a very important discussion, and one that matters enormously for the human rights of all of us. But in particular, we are calling attention to the fact that the persons who do not conform to gender norms are facing increased risk of persecution due to a steep rise in the propagation of exclusionary narratives and practices. Because of this year, the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity conducted an investigation into the incorporation of gender and gender identity in international human rights law, and also looked at the backlash against it. The independent experts' research included several consultations and a record number of submissions, more than any other ever received by a mandate holder in a call for inputs. This tells you the importance of the issue, but as you would know, it is also an issue that is on the edge of many different kinds of contestations. As I want to note that because it is unusual to say that we have to prevent against hate speech, but we need to understand that we are talking about important subjects, and we will listen to presentations and questions that are carefully and respectfully provided to us. This is a practice of the independent expert, and in his reports, he has been including many different forms of analysis and listening to the responses of states. His reports were recently presented to the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. We have an extraordinary team of panelists joining us today to discuss these reports and to answer questions. But first, we're going to hear opening remarks from Victor Madrigal-Borloz himself, the Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher at Harvard's Human Rights Program. Victor, it is a pleasure to have you here. It is incredible that you have done this work. It is important to so many of us. And please begin to walk us on this journey. Tell us a bit about the reasoning that you were following as you centered this thematic research on gender during the past year. And what are the main findings of that exercise?
Thank you very much, Ali, and I trust that you can hear me well. Thank you. I want to warmly thank you, Ali, for these words of introduction, but also mostly for ensuring that we have now such a good playing ground for this conversation. You've really established not only the rules of the conversation, but also you've dived immediately into the substance and the importance of the matter. And I want to thank you very much for everybody in this conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that Ali Miller has been part of an extraordinary group of women who have been supportive of the mandate since its creation and have taught me a lot about the subject matters in which I work. And for that, I'm very thankful, Ali, as well as I am thankful to the other extraordinary women who join me in this conversation today, in which I expect to learn a lot in this constant work of learning. As you all know, the mandate of the independent expert on protection from violence and discrimination and gender identity was created on the conviction that these traits, that these elements lie at the base of enormous violence and discrimination that is perpetrated every day against people around the globe in ways that only begin to be apparent to us now, and with the mandate of providing visibility as to the way in which that violence and discrimination occurs, and to advise effective measures that can be adopted by states to address such violence and discrimination. Now, within that context, it has become apparent to me that one of the fundamental political, legal discussions in the international arena today is precisely the extent to which gender has been incorporated in international human rights law, and whether that incorporation actually has consequence in the everyday lived experience of persons and what those consequences are. As we know, gender theory approaches recognize that the meanings attached to sex and other differences in relation to social roles and behaviors and expectations are socially created. Gender is indeed one of the most significant experience that an individual will have during their life. It will influence social, economic, political inclusion and all forms of participation in social life. It also informs expectations for roles and for the way people express themselves and for the expectations that they can have in their quest for happiness and fulfillment. And one of the elements in which this mandate actually exists is the reality that gender determines actions for human beings in recent history and in most forms of institutionalized forms of state organization, according to categorization into two and only two molds, the mold of women and the mold of men. This construction is at the root of power asymmetries, social inequality, and fundamental violence that is experienced primarily by women and girls, including lesbian, bisexual, and trans women. And of course, as a consequence, a political and legal articulation of gender emerges as a necessary to transform, to challenge systems of dominance and oppression. And I would like to add as a corollary that in that sense, it is also a fundamental concept to address systems of toxic masculinity in that aspect. Now, gender-based approaches, as we know, also challenge the assumption that gender identity necessarily correlates with biological sex and recognize the validity of a wide range of sexual orientations and gender identities. The recognition of gender as determined by social construct is common, I've learned, to many feminisms, as well as queer theory. And as well as the recognition that gender, sex, and sexuality interconnect with other axes of power and identification, such as race and age, ethnicity, religion, ability, and experiences of disability and health status. Now, this is one of the genius in which this mandate was crafted. And Ali, as you know, I take no credit in it because it was the visionary work of civil society and receptive states. But it's one of the genius in which this mandate is crafted is that it's a mandate that is requested to operate within intersectional approaches. Is in this understanding that, as one sub-Saharan activist said to me once in a meeting where you also were present, Ali, we all reunite many identities in one body. And our experiences of privilege and or discrimination and violence are created by the compounded effect of those identities in a given context and in a given place and in a given time. Now, the perpetuation of inequality rooted in gender norms in reality proves to be disadvantageous to most of the world population. And this is one of the elements that I continued exploring in these reports, disproportionately impacting women and girls in all of their diversity, but compounding impacts for what ends up being the majority of the world population. And this is one of the reasons why I think gender-based frameworks are such a powerful tool to question organizations of power that are basically unfair and unjust. This is why I find the importance of these approaches providing recognition of how race is gendered and how gender is raised, as well as many other factors which affect how one person is allocated rights, privileges, or deficits and limits or rights through social regulation. Now, this year, I set out to investigate the incorporation of gender work frameworks in international human rights law because of two reasons. It became apparent to me that in the international arena, at every level of United Nations political discourse and political debate, there has been a trend easily traced to the last decade or so to question the incorporation of gender-based frameworks in legal language pertaining in treaty law and resolutions and declarations and the instruments of international human rights law. And these trends appear to be a contradiction, or if you may, a backlash to the significant conquests of feminisms since the 80s, and of course, importantly reflected in very many of the programs of action and legal frameworks, not only at the level of the United Nations, but also very importantly, regionally in instruments aimed at the combat of violence against women, such as the Istanbul Convention or the Convention of Belém do Pará. And not only the United Nations, but also the Eurospace and the inter-American space, as well as evidently also the African space, regionally, are permeated with strong debates as to whether gender is validly incorporated under international human rights law. The Organization of American States at this very moment is carrying out a virtual General Assembly with bases virtually in Guatemala, where this is one, I would venture to say, of the three main political topics of discussion. So it is a very, very real discussion. And I have learned that there are foreign ministries and departments charged with the foreign relations of the states, in which the instruction has been very simple. Strike gender as a word from every declaration that is coming before you and replace it with equality of men and women. A difference that would seem innocuous or perhaps to the inadvertent observer, but that entails the defense of systems in which most of the injustice in the world is being built, including, of course, a defense of the binary that I'm going to be talking about in just a second. Now, the second consequence of this questioning of incorporation is, of course, a subsidiary and, in my way, residual but pernicious debate that actually questions the existence of concepts such as gender identity. Now, throughout this process, I learned that gender identity was part of the feminism's framework of gender in an understanding that nobody possesses the abstraction of gender in their body. We all live in gendered societies, and as persons living in gendered societies, we take decisions under coercion or freedom about the way that we relate to gender expectations and roles that are either imposed or suggested, in the best of cases, to us. And of course, that set of decisions which manifest themselves internally and externally is what my mandate understands as gender identity. In a way, relating, of course, all of these concepts into the reality that, as my mandate has said, every person in the world possesses a gender identity if you actually identify that gender identity as a concept encompassing all of those decisions and expressions related to the way a person decides or submits themselves to gender expectations and roles. Why is this important? Because another element that I wanted to explore in these reports is the notion, which I find to be legally flawed, that only trans and gender diverse persons possess gender identity, which is, of course, a equivocal process in legal terminology, because it leads to the conclusion that when we speak about violence based on gender identity, we are only talking about trans persons, and we are speaking of a particular and exclusive set of rights, which, of course, it's a contention that I am challenging after the findings of my report. Now, Ali, my quest, as you may now have seen, it was essentially a legal one. it was based on a research question on whether gender and gender-based frameworks have been incorporated in human rights law. The research included a series of methodological steps. You have made reference to those, but it was indeed a process through which I was humbled by an incredibly rich participative processes. And due to this level of interest and the enormity of the questions involved, and what I learned about the enormity of the consequences of this debate, I decided to extend my query from one report to two. And the manner in which I divided this element was the result of a deliberate design that aims at describing what I consider to be two paths before the international community at this time. The first report, which I presented to the Human Rights Council in June of this year, and that I entitled The Law of Inclusion, I actually carried out an examination of gender and gender-based frameworks under what I consider to be the most rancid international law theory, which is basically the essence of Article 38 in the statute of the International Court of Justice. As you know, Article 38 in the statute invites us to examine whether international human rights, international law in general, has been created by examining international conventions, whether general or particular, establishing rules expressly recognized by contesting states in contention before the court. It also invites us to look at international custom as evidence of general practice accepted as law, the general principles of law recognized by, I'm going to put a word in italics or brackets, civilized nations. There's a date in which the statute was adopted, so of course we all know that. And then finally, subject to the provisions of Article 59 in the statute, judicial decisions and teachings of the most qualified publicists of the various nations as subsidiary means for the determination of the rules of law. Again, this rancid theory describing the process of creation of international law. And what I did in the law of inclusion was to follow that thread and interrogate these different elements in the international arena to reach the conclusion, after examining all of the aspects laid out in Article 38, that indeed gender and gender-based frameworks have been firmly reincorporated in international human rights law in a way that can be understood as a robust recognition that they constitute necessary concepts for the analysis of asymmetries of power that lie at the base of most violence and discrimination, again, that are faced disproportionately and horridly by women and girls in all of their diversity, but that extends its pernicious effects to, of course, most of the world population and ends up placing very few at the top of the echelons of power and privilege. The second part of my report, then, once that part of the legal framework was established, the second part of my report analyzes exclusionary narratives and practices that aim to counter progressive recognition of human rights standards relating to gender equality and sexuality. And the discourse is often framed as a resistance to the imposition of a so-called quote unquote gender ideology, a concept that I found through my inquiry to be a symbolic vessel used with the objective of evoking a global conspiracy and creating moral panic, and utilizing basketing, if the word exists in English, strategies aiming at capturing a series of claims and submissions that are emotionally significant to people, but amongst which there is very little coherence. And of course, we all know that narratives of so-called gender ideology may include issues relating from sexual and reproductive rights to comprehensive sexual education, to same-sex marriage, to the fight for gender parity, to particular aspects of access to abortion and so on and so forth. It's a never-ending group of claims and contentions that are grouped under a series of assumptions that are um, created under this aspect. And in that, it's reflective of one of the realities that I found in my inquiry, and it's the fact that all of these aspects and gender-based framework and their recognition under international law are inextricably linked to concepts such as bodily autonomy and, of course, comprehensive sexual education, because there are a number of constituting elements that are uniting, of course, the legal constructions around these issues. Now, anti-gender narratives have continued to gain traction since the 1990s. They appear to be a response to advances regarding the empowerment of women and girls, carried out by themselves through the feminisms that have so much achieved. And of course, these narratives have always opposed sexual and reproductive rights, comprehensive sexuality education, and also the furthering of the rights of LGBTI persons. The narratives resonate with conservative platforms, and in my conclusions, they are used strategically to energize and galvanize political bases with successful results in national election campaigns around the world. And it is one of the aspects that I think we will need to continue mapping, the extent to which there has been a politicization of the agenda of gender justice, to the effect where now around the world, there are many countries where you can see it neatly aligned with political platforms relating to party X or party Y. No pun intended on the use of X or Y, really that just happened. But party X or party Y, meaning, of course, different spectrums in the political platform, where it appears to be that gender justice is a political ideology, when in reality, it's the most human of human ideas. Of course, these ideas tend, in my findings, to instill the idea of a monolithic religious of cultural identity, enhancing their grip on political, social, and economic power. These strategic objectives are all enabled through a series of common traits, including tactics of flexibility and adaptability to local contexts, vigorous social media messaging with the purpose of giving the appearance of strength in numbers, when that is in many cases not an objective reality. Simple and catchy slogans. We all know of buses going around Latin America with the words "do not mess around with my children" painted on the side, on the implication that LGBT, the human rights of LGBT persons are essentially an agenda of abuse. And of course, these movements also have an ability to leverage resources from followers based on campaigns that oppose progress in social rights. My findings is that this discourse is not based on scientific evidence, but it's heavily reliant on stigma, misconception, and in many cases, anecdotal evidence that seeks to evoke emotion by the presentation of individual cases that, of course, as individual cases have the concern of human rights-based approaches, but are not necessarily a good basis for the formulation of public policy. These narratives deliberately conflate biological realities of sex characteristics with the social construct of gender to deny the individual's agency over their own destiny and to maintain a status quo of that ends up being beneficial, as I said, beneficial to a very few. Anti-gender narratives, early in my conclusions of this report, are based on biological determinism and therefore are in direct opposition to international human rights law. And it is here that I actually have reached the legal and human rights-based conclusion that the international human rights framework is put in place to ensure the right of every person to determine the confines of their own existence. This is the essence of freedom and dignity, which are at the basis of the consensus expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was, as we know, adopted 73 years ago, and that continues to be, in my view, the great beacon of light in this idea that every person in this planet is born not only with certain rights, but also with the liberty and the dignity that accompany the quest for happiness and fulfillment. Now, time is short, and I'm sure that we will have other discussions. Ali, I just want to underline that, of course, in my report, I examine the subsidiary narratives of exclusion, which question the concept of gender identity and question the idea of of legal recognition of gender identity based on self-identification. Ali, I receive evidence from around the world, and I travel the world, and I have, in my travels, come into contact with what I would say is a very, very significant number of persons whose lives exist beyond the binary, whose lives are in the placement of the gender diverse, whose lives are in self-identification as trans women and trans men. And I can tell you without a shred of a doubt that lack of legal recognition based on self-identification lies at the base of most of the violence, most of the discrimination, and most of the affronts that this person suffer, and that constitute a stain in the human conscience. I am convinced that legal recognition based on self-identification is a positive duty of states if we are to effectively and honestly address violence and discrimination that impacts hundreds of thousands of trans women and men and gender diverse persons around the world. I examined some of the arguments concerning the alleged threat for the rights of women and girls, and arguments connected to that, including alleged threat to participation in sports, such an important mechanism of social inclusion, or the alleged threat to rights to children. And I found those arguments not to be based on evidence and also not to be supported by law. And one of the quests that I'm actually hoping to continue is engaging with states and with a wide range of stakeholders to ensure that we build bridges of understanding in relation to the fact that the law and the evidence support systems of legal recognition based on self-identification. I'm very eager for the conversation. Ali, you have been wonderfully patient with me. I very much appreciate your courtesy and look forward very much to the conversation with other panelists and with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. And I think I can say that we are here to talk about exactly all those incredibly important topics. And before we turn to the panelists, I wanted to flag the three ways in which I think your framing really matters to all of us, which is first, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to be part of incredibly important work around a common project of human rights at its fundamental, as you restated it, creating the conditions where people can live the lives that they desire with the determinations supported by law and by the kind of economic and social conditions they need. So the invitation is to do the work together. The second piece, which I want to flag for all of us, is the clarity of using legal analysis with the lens of gender to reveal the way in which power works and the way in which people are put at risk. And that process of using the gender lens within law. And then that final piece, the way in which law is a framework that either enables or constrains action. And so we are here to look at the ways in which we can enable the action that will allow people to live lives with dignity across a range of genders. And that clarity of invitation, analysis that reveals both the ways in which there's some continuities, but the specific new ways that gender is being mobilized to reduce the space of people's inclusion in society are incredibly important. So that it is not just old stuff. This is new stuff we are confronting. And with that form of understanding, action, and clarity of gender analysis, I want to turn to our team of panelists who we've gathered from all around the world and from different movements and sectors working on gender. Our first panelist, Julia Aert, has been recently appointed the executive director of ILGA World, and we, in that sense, congratulate her again. Prior to that, well, ILGA World is an organization that has over 1,700 members from 168 countries advocating, the numbers must be wrong, many more members from 168 countries advocating for the human rights of LGBTI persons, and ILGA has existed since 1978. Before coming in as the new executive director, Julia was the executive director of Transgender Europe, where she contributed significantly to how trans issues are perceived and debated in Europe and beyond. So to start us off, Julia, how to begin perhaps where Victor stopped his conversation, but with the invitation to think about this surge of anti-gender discourse and the practices. How has this mattered for the work and achievements of the LGBTI movement as you have been involved in your old way and in your new incarnation? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Victor, and your team for the invitation to speak here today. I have to say it's an honor to be speaking at this event. And as you just said, I was just appointed ED of ILGA World, and it's the first time that I speak publicly in this role, which of course I didn't know when I accepted the invitation. But I don't think there was a better event for that. Because as a trans activist, an LGBTI activist, and a feminist of almost 20 years by now, I think anti-gender discourses and practices are, in a sense, the quest of my activist life. So, coming to your question, Ali, what's the impact of anti-gender practice on our work at ILGA World? And for that, I want to start with sharing an example with you. Our European region, ILGA Europe, has been publishing an index assessing the legal situation of LGBTI people in their region for by now 13 years. It's called the Rainbow Europe Index. And in the first decade of that index, the first 10 years, the narrative around the legal situation was like that. Well, the situation is not good. It's not as good as it could be. Actually, it's quite bad in some parts. But there's considerable and quite widespread legal process across Europe. That's been the narrative for 10 years. So that has changed. I'll give you 3 quotes from the last 3 years. In 2019, they found that for the first time, in the index 10-year history, countries are moving backwards as existing laws and policies disappeared. 2020, there has been no positive change in 49% of the countries analyzed. For the second year in a row, countries are moving backwards in the Rainbow Index as existing protections are disappearing. And in 2021, against the backdrop of hardly any positive change in all countries, those who have moved up in the ranking are moving up only because of very small changes implemented. And despite clear commitments on rainbow family recognition, not one country has moved on partnership and parenthood recognition, and there's no change this year for intersex and trans rights apart from Iceland. So you can clearly see that there is a break, and I want to stress here that the data from those analyses are the majority of the data is pre-pandemic. So the pandemic is not the reason why things have changed, because the 2019 data is actually from 2018 and so forth. So all of this is pre-pandemic, and I think as well, reading Victor's report and its findings, it can be stated that anti-gender practices and narratives of exclusions can be seen as an effect in this index. So we indeed see a surge in anti-gender discourse and practice. So unfortunately, opposition to SOGI issues is not a new thing, of course. I think sexual reproductive health and rights, LGBTI issues, and women's rights have faced opposition since even way before women put their foot down for our rights to vote. So what is new these days? So I think what is new is that we see a concerted attack on gender equality, women's and SOGI-esque rights that weaponizes SOGI-esque issues, in particular including anti-trans and anti-gender narratives. And it weaponizes SOGI-esque issues not only in an attack on gender equality, but in an attack that goes way beyond gender equality. And I think it's important to understand both aspects. One, so what do I mean by SOGI-esque issues are weaponized? And I think Victor has spoken a little bit to that, well, of course in his report, but as well in his intervention today. So the thought that LGBTI people are like intrinsically immoral, sinful, and wrong, or at least some kind of suspicious, is a quite widespread belief, and it's easily connects with a conservative mainstream beliefs and values. And our traditional opponents who have been there all the time, they're using that to cultivate those narratives of exclusion. Because, as said, those connect to a widespread suspicion towards and rejection of LGBTI people in general. So Victor has unpacked some of these frames in his report. There's negation, defense of the national state, traditional values. What all these have in common is that while on the surface they're about rejection of LGBTI people, these frames are as well used for other purposes. They become a tool to attack progress made on gender equality and the fight against gender-based violence. And they seek to infringe as well on democratic rule and the rule of law. And they constitute an effort to deflect attention away from socio-economic hardships and financial crises in many societies. And that's what I mean by weaponizing. So on the surface, it's about LGBTI issues. It might as well be about gender. But very often, these narratives and frames are used, well, to attack that, but as well for different purposes around the rule of law, democratic rule, etc., as I've said. And to underline that, I think Victor gives in his report many examples on that, but I think the one that really stuck out for me is the one from Colombia. So in paragraph 12 of the report, he writes, and I quote here, "The gender ideology narrative casts a wide net. It was noted in several submissions that this narrative was a crucial part for the strategy used in the campaign against the final agreement for ending the conflict and building a stable, lasting peace in Colombia in 2016. Now you'll ask, what has the peace process in Colombia to do with gender narratives? And that's exactly the point. It's not about gender narratives, but it's to achieve a different type of goal. So, and my point here is that this means our answer, an answer to that backlash, can not only focus on pushback on their LGBTI or gender narrative. It needs a much broader response from human and social rights, feminist, and an LGBTI perspective. So the sad thing about that is, I believe, that at the end of the day, this is not even for us about achieving positive change, but as we've seen in the early example about in Europe, it's about holding our ground. And I think that's the sad part. And because I didn't want to end up on this sad notion that we're in a phase where we need to hold our ground, I think at the same time, it's as well a prime opportunity for our movements, various movements, to forge alliances that go beyond. Alliances that root in the core principles and values that we share as feminist human rights activists, and that root in the realization that together, as movements, coming together, we are unbreakable. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was very, very powerful, and exactly the applause. But I think just to emphasize that this notion that things can both be dangerous in themselves and a deflection away from other kinds of dangers is such a critical point to hold on to because it means when we work, as you say, Julia, in solidarity, we need to be looking in both places. We can't do one or the other. It is both, because they are both serious restrictions on gender rights, and they are attempts to destroy democratic space. So that working in both places is only enabled, in fact, as you say, by forms of both analytic solidarity and then action solidarity. I do need to make one technical point here before I turn to Melissa. We are asking participants to use the chat for questions because the Q&A function has not yet been enabled. And there are already questions coming in the chat, and we're going to hold questions till after all our panelists have spoken, and then we're going to move to those questions, and I will be taking them in groups. But I do want to move now quickly to Melissa Upreti, who is the chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, who is both a human rights lawyer and a women's rights advocate, working toward the end of child marriage, for sexual and reproductive rights, and advocating for the recognition and fulfillment of women's rights through the use of national, regional, and international law and mechanisms, which makes you the perfect person to talk about the way both how you see working on the question of how the anti-gender or anti-trans narrative is detrimental to the to all women and girls, but then to combine that with the way in which that matters for the role of the UN, your mandate, and for all these different national and legal structures. So thank you for joining us, Melissa.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to be with you, and of course, with the other panelists. I do want to start by congratulating the independent expert, Victor, a very dear colleague of mine, on the publication of an excellent report, an excellent analysis, which I think has given us even more language and perspective to really talk about these issues and to really sort of confront the challenges that we face. I also want to acknowledge, Julia, your remarks. We've never been on a panel together before, but the insights that you just shared and the call to action are also really incredibly important. So thank you for sharing those. So now to answer the question, I've been given 5 minutes, so I'm going to try my best to just touch upon a few things. This by no means reflects the entire thinking of the working group. We have so much to say on this issue. We've done a lot of thinking ourselves. We are navigating this territory, along with many of you, and learning in the process, as we're also trying to preserve and uphold human rights and hold states accountable for their obligations. But what I'll start by saying is, just really in direct response to the question about how these narratives are detrimental to all women and girls, it really is because all of them are anchored in a very harmful and dangerous ideology that is inherently discriminatory and aims to oppress, exploit women and girls, in addition to being antithetical to the concept of human rights. Now, in our work, the working group, among other things, is we've referred to this as the instrumentalization of women's bodies. That's one way in which we have described this, which in our mind involves subjecting women and girls to a patriarchal political agenda to keep them in a subordinate position. And this is expressed through the systematic denial of women's and girls' autonomy and agency in all matters, and is enforced by means of violence, including lethal violence. Now, conservative, religious, civil society, and even some state actors have been working together and relying on this type of ideology to advance a political agenda that undermines human rights globally, including in the Human Rights Council, which is where some of us work, and within the UN at large. And as we have begun to see, they're even succeeding in undermining women's constitutionally protected rights at the national level too. Now, as a mandate, we recognize that women are not a monolithic group, and the progress that we so often refer to in terms of the recognition of women's rights as human rights, and even of the recognition of violence against women as a human rights violation, particularly since the 90s, these gains have not been enjoyed equally across the board. There are deep inequities and disparities linked to individual identity, status, as well as histories of oppression and colonialism, which have gotten worse due to persistent systemic discrimination, exploitation, failures, and/or neglect by our political, economic, and social systems. And none of these have happened by accident, but by design. because all of these systems stand on and are sustained by a power imbalance that stems from patriarchy and is characterized by pervasive misogyny. Sadly, misogyny is entrenched in many of our key institutions, which in part explains the impunity surrounding some of the worst crimes against women and girls. Now, the COVID pandemic, as some of the panelists have already acknowledged, and measures taken by states in response to it have only worsened the situation, which makes this discussion even more relevant. Now, moving on to what the role of the UN is and the working group's mandate amidst these conflicting narratives, very briefly. With regard to the role of the UN, all agencies, branches, and entities that constitute the UN must recognize and take a unified stance against the backlash. That is, these efforts to roll back rights and to deny the fulfillment of rights that already exist. And the UN must be more proactive in defending human rights. This is an important goal in and of itself, and it must be a clearer and more central focus of the UN's key priorities in the areas of development, peace, and security, and it must be part of their practice. There needs to be a stronger adherence to the core principles of human rights in all processes and negotiations that take place within the ambit of the UN. Now, efforts led by the UN to advance the rights of women and girls who represent half of humanity and are systematically disadvantaged must be undertaken in a manner that respects the universality of human rights and recognizes them as interrelated and interdependent. Now, one would think that this would be very obvious, but in practice, we see that these principles are not consistently adhered to. Now, progress cannot be made by working in silos, and in fact, this will only benefit our political opponents. Further, it is important for key actors, especially member states, to not cherry pick rights and make trade-offs that undermine human rights, especially of those individuals in situations of heightened risk and vulnerability as a result of being discriminated against in the first place. Member states that frequently oppose the rights of LGBTIQ+ people are usually the same ones that oppose the rights of women and girls to equality within the family and the enjoyment of their sexual and reproductive rights, among others. Their strategy of creating confusion by questioning the meaning of settled concepts and rights and using misinformation to undermine the human rights system as a whole must be met with a unified response. Different branches of the human rights movement must work together by finding common ground on key issues. They must work hand in hand and in coordination and not in opposition to each other. Briefly, as for the role of my mandate, what I will say is that in terms of our approach, we recognize that the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination against women and girls around the world and within countries, that they reinforce and sustain each other. And without an intersectional approach, it is impossible to achieve substantive equality. In terms of our work, in our 2018 report titled Reasserting Equality and Countering Rollbacks, we noted the backlash against women's rights and against the use of the term gender. And many of our thoughts are also reflected in Victor's positions in his new reports. I see a lot of alignment. In 2020, we published a position paper on gender equality and gender backlash in the context of the increasing misuse of the concept of gender, the abuse of the concept of gender, and attacks on gender equality and women's rights, since we considered it important to clarify the use of the concept in relation to our own mandate. In recent years, we have witnessed and responded through communications and other means to the emergence of campaigns and legislative proposals to restrict or ban abortion. This is an area where we have seen a lot of activity. We have also observed attacks on sexuality education and gender-sensitive education involving cuts to academia and even the teaching of the topic of gender. Finally, we've also observed and responded to the hostility towards women human rights defenders, especially those working on the rights contested by fundamentalist groups, such as women's sexual and reproductive rights and the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons, as well as those denouncing the actions of extractive industries and businesses. These defenders have been at heightened risk of violence, including lethal violence resulting in murder. Now, this just sums up a few aspects of our work, and I'd be very happy to respond to questions later. So thank you. Back to you, Ali.
Thanks, Melissa. And I think the focus on the way in which both women's human rights defenders and LGBTI advocates and defenders are being attacked brings home again Julia's point about the way in which this is both an attack on the rights and on the space to claim rights, right? And I think we really want to keep both of those in mind. We were going to turn briefly because Victor has presented this report to states, and we wanted to give our audience a little bit of a sense of the response to this report from states. I think because of time, we're going to just look at two short videos, one from Thailand and one from Poland. Is that right, Victor? And if we have time, perhaps Italy. And then we're going to open to both to the panelists generally and to the audience at large. Thank you. I think we're all working on, is it some technical difficulties we have?
Aligns itself with the statement by the European Union. Italy reiterates its strong support for the mandate of the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and welcome its latest report on practices of exclusion. Italy reaffirms its strong commitment for the promotion and the protection of the rights of LGBTI persons. At national level, we have launched a broad national consultation with a view to draft a national multi-annual strategy for the promotion of the rights of LGBTI persons and their protection from violence and discrimination. This is expected to be adopted by the end of the year. Moreover, the Italian Parliament has recently approved a law aimed at establishing and reinforcing refugee centers for LGBTI persons, mainly victims of domestic violence. This year, we will give an enhanced financial contribution through the Italian Development Cooperation to the Global Equality Fund. It is inconceivable that still today, some 70 states criminalize LGBTI relations. Discriminalizing homosexuality is a crucial step toward ensuring genuine equality before the law. Focused outreach and constant engagement to this end are crucial. The UN system should strengthen its action by developing an institutional strategy to build on the efforts that are being carried out worldwide to enhance the respect.
I thank the distinguished representative.
So I think we just had that little clip from the delegate from Mission of Italy committing to including LGBTI issues on their political agenda. But ironically, on the day directly following the dialogue, October 27th, the Parliament voted down a bill regarding homophobia and transphobia as hate crimes. So we're seeing supports and a contradiction at the same time. So I'm wondering, Victor, if you wanted to speak first about the way that these very tangible tension is arising around the world and what steps and range of laws and policies you're finding most useful to reverse those trends.
Thank you so much, Ali. And of course, I very much appreciated that expression of support and of commitment by the Italian state, which, as you say, was followed by this very public, very well documented, and very well discussed at the international arena, a lack of adoption by Parliament of. And Ali, I think that there is a very good example there about the enormous complexity of the dynamics in which this respect of rights and the furtherance and backlash of rights is actually inscribed. I think, if I may illustrate with one anecdote in relation to this, that particular legislation was the object of a conversation that I had not long ago with a very high-ranking member of the Catholic Church. And I will not disclose more details in relation to that. It may not be that relevant specifically to the discussion. But this high-ranking officer, when I presented my mandate and I expressed that I was with the idea of furthering the human rights of LGBT persons, this person replied and said, sir, your mandate scares me a little bit because now you're going to make it a crime to actually question the right to oppose same-sex marriage. And you're going to make it a crime to oppose any issue that actually relates to contravening what one might perceive as the LGBT agenda. And throughout that meeting, which was meant to be a very short hearing or audience that would last 10 minutes, what I took was the opportunity to dispel the myth that I actually was interested in curtailing anybody's right to freedom of expression, or as a matter of fact, anybody's right to freedom of religion or belief, which, as you may know, are rights that are mutually interdependent and that in fact reinforce each other because they're all based on the idea of dignity and freedom. And so this was ended up being a very good meeting. I forget exactly how long, but it ended up lasting like 2 hours. My interlocutor and I, neither of us has a problem with talking. So it ended up being a very long discussion about the many points of actual finding that we found in our missions of ensuring that people would not subject violence and discrimination on the basis of who they are. And how much of a joint agenda it was, and how easy it was to identify the things in which we disagreed and frameworks to actually address them in a way in which we actually found mutual respect. However, the crux of that discussion was we were ready to actually speak on the basis of evidence and to abandon our prejudice. And to me, this is, Ali, to answer your question, the basis of what Italian example presents to us. For people who followed the parliamentary debate around this legislation, it was unfortunately placed in the realm of prejudice. There was so much political narratives surrounding the idea that this would make criminals of all Catholic priests, that all of the clergy would actually be imprisoned or would all need to concentrate in the square mile of the Vatican so that it would be free from persecution. That the idea was to ensure an agenda where that freedom of expression and that freedom of religion and belief will be curtailed. And of course, that informed the way parliamentary debate went. So it's an example. It's a very good example of the importance of responsible political debate that is based on facts, that is not reacting to prejudice and fear. Let me give you another example. I've expressed already my concern by the adoption of congresses and parliaments everywhere of legislation restricting access of trans girls to sport. In many cases, with responsible politicians saying that they could not even cite one case happening in their particular jurisdiction of a trans person accessing sports. So it's a quick demonstration. And I would like to draw a connection to something that Ali, you alluded to, and it's a wonderful segue to make. And with this, I will stop. It is essentially about erosion of the democratic space. It is essentially against the creation of legislation that is fact-based, evidence-based, and therefore that is really addressing the real problems that people face. But to connect with Melissa and to Julia's points, which I found very rich in this respect, it's also about maintaining women and girls outside of power, because that is, in essence, the way that democratic spaces are managed. So a good example, and the Italian case, I just issued a tweet welcoming the appointment of Mr. Fabrizio Petri as a special envoy for LGTB issues by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I have great hopes for this expressed willingness to actually forward not only domestically, but also internationally, these aspects. And it's a good example of the way in which the contradictions expressed by Julia in contexts that are perceived as acquired contexts are still making us exist in a context of holding our ground, as Julia said. Thank you so much, Ali.
And just to, for example, the question of trans girls in sport, I was discussing with a colleague from South Korea that conversation has moved there. And when I asked them, well, what's the status of girls in sport generally? What's their support? What are the barriers? There was a kind of, oh, yes, right. So this deflection and fear, right, is exactly as Julia described. So I think unless either of the panelists want to speak to Italy, we're going to hear next a short clip from Poland. Yeah.
Regrets, and we need to clarify that references to while aligning itself with the statements of the European Union, and Poland wishes to offer some additional remarks. After reading the report, we must express our regrets, and we need to clarify that references to Poland are simply not accurate. Mr. Independent Expert, in your report, you mentioned resolutions, I quote, issued by a significant number of Polish counties and municipalities declaring themselves as free from so-called LGBT ideology, unquote. Let me explain that the opinions expressed in these resolutions serve primarily to emphasize attachment to traditional values, especially traditional family model rooted in Christian faith. They do not deny the human rights or alter the legal protection of LGBT persons in any way. They do not constitute acts of local law. Therefore, they do not serve as source of any binding rights or obligations. By the way, most of them have been changed or revoked recently, seeing the growing misunderstanding and misinterpretation. You also indicate that, I quote, in Poland, there is a public policy that appears to promote the idea that the human rights of LGBT persons are not protected, along with deeply dehumanizing language used by religious and political leaders. We take this opportunity to reiterate that equality before the law and general prohibition of discrimination on any basis is enshrined in the Constitution of Poland. LGBTI persons have the right to be fully protected against hate, violence, discrimination, and hate speech, and this right is effectively protected in practice as well. Thank you.
So I think, I know our panelists wanted to respond. Julia, did you want to speak, speaking from the European perspective?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ali. Actually, not so much from a European perspective, but I think the question that comes up here in the intervention from Poland is in essence whether religious and traditional family values are fundamentally opposed to the rights of LGBTI person. And I would personally argue that that alleged opposition between those two, or between those rights, is mostly fabricated. I mean, yes, there are religions that define consensual same-sex behavior between adults as sinful. On the other hand, there's like many LGBTI believers and practices of their religion. And when it comes to family values, I think it's even more, I would argue, almost obvious, because the traditional family values frame basically says that family consists of a mother, father, and children. But that's kind of a description of a family or a certain type of family, but it's not a value. So I think the value that relates to families, or the values that relate to families, more evolve around caring for each other, making commitments for very often for a lifetime for each other, having and raising children, creating a home, creating community as a private and protected space, and as well making economic commitments. So those are the values behind that. And what traditional family values does is equating the mother, father, child narrative with that this is the only space where these values can be upheld. And I would that's a clear fabrication, because that is not what family. That's not the only space where caring for each other happens, and that's just one of these narratives that are used because it kind of connects again to a conservative mainstream. I do admit that when you look at the family values, it requires, like the actual family values of mutual care, it requires a certain openness in the concept of what families are. But as I've said, the notion around that traditional families are mother, father, and children are, and in the end, just a frame that creates an artificial contradiction between the family value on the one hand and LGBTI issues on the other. So it becomes not about the values of the family, but it constitutes around who or what is a family. And I think the narrative has another effect. If family values is equated with families, men, women, children, it as well invisibilizes that there are families that do not uphold that value of care and community, but that family can as well be a space where intimate partner violence happens, where abuse happens, and that traditional conservative frame invisibilizes that. And I would even go a step further and say that the sense of traditional family values become a threat to their own values, because that they claim to defend, because namely mutual care and long-term commitment and raising children, are the values that should be honed in the context of the family, which has nothing to do, as I said, with who the family actually is, and neglecting all other types of families actually is a contrapoint to the value of mutual care and commitment. And therefore, the traditional frame kind of opposes, in a certain awkward way, what they're trying to defend.
Thank you. I think that does an amazing job at holding together and keeping our view on what are the values of care and what is made invisible by these claims. And that is exactly the practice of holding on to two lenses that we're really trying to do, I think, in using the work that Victor has invited us to. I would like to turn now to some of the questions coming from the chat. And Melissa, if I could put you on the hot seat first, because we haven't heard from you. I was noting that we noted that there are a number of listeners and participants in this conversation from corporations who are corporate leaders who are asking what the corporate community can do to help and what potential first steps can be taken. If you, from ideas from you first, and then the other panelists, perhaps.
Yeah, I think one important thing that the corporate community and businesses can do, for example, in response to discrimination and violence, is to not invisibilize it by reinforcing gender stereotypes and stigma. They need to create spaces where victim survivors, regardless of their sex, gender identity, can talk about these issues in an environment that is non-judgmental. I think corporations and businesses right now actually have an incredible opportunity to do this in a more formal way with the adoption of a new international instrument, the ILO's Convention 190, which focuses on violence and harassment and applies to workers of all, in all categories and of different identities. This new instrument actually is very inclusive. And it is an instrument that can be invoked and utilized by workers to directly challenge violence, harassment, and discrimination. So I would say that using the content of that, the broad definition of worker, the world of work, the obligation to ensure that every worker has the right to an environment that is free from violence and harassment, and taking very concrete steps. Actually, there's a recommendation, number 206, that accompanies ILO Convention C-190 that very specifically talks about what employers can do, which includes things like even conducting risk assessments to see if there are certain workers who may be at risk of suffering violence and discrimination in the workplace, to actually providing things like leave and flexibility in the workspace, and other measures that can go a long way in combating stigma, and also promoting accountability through the establishment of mechanisms. So these are some of the things that I think employers can do right away.
It's wonderful. It's really a practice of inclusion in some ways, following up on Victor's first report, where he was really trying to focus on how the law allows us to include. There's another set of questions that address the way in which social media plays a huge role in spreading anti-gender ideology. And I'm wondering if which of you would like to think with us. And I actually want to pair that a bit with one of the questions that, because social media crosses boundaries, right? It means that the flow of anti-gender ideology attacks moves across borders. One of the questions raised specific countries, global North, global South. I'd like to, wondering who wants to speak first to that question.
Ali, if I may, and asking the leniency of my colleagues, just perhaps to highlight that there's two aspects of those discussions that are important to me. I think we are all, and when I say all, is every person concerned with human rights and with the fight against bullying and the asymmetries of power and the damage that gets done by violence throughout the social networks. We're really interested in understanding more how causation and how responsibility happen in those processes. And of course, that work is part of what my mandate will be continuing to undertake in the future. There's clear, but I wanted to tie it up with the second point, which is where I think I have some information to provide, and is there is a link between the strategies of the so-called anti-gender movements or strategies and the use of social media in ways that are very inventive and that come directly from the playbook of marketing. And one of those strategies is very important for me to convey, is to portray strength in numbers and to portray alleged diversities that are not really existing. One of the exercises that we did is with several of the documentary threads that were given to me as inputs, we actually followed where they came from, and we were able to track them to 3 sources. But of course, they appeared to be in the hundreds, but in reality, when interrogated, they came up to only come from 3 sources. And of course, the problem and the challenge about this is that you cannot do that with every tweet that gets done, where suddenly you see an inundation, and a number of strategies interacting with that. But I think it is important that we question that. And now every time that I'm actually led to act, and my motivation is, well, you had this number of tweets, or you had this number of likes, or this and that, I look into them because I'm not really sure what is behind it. And I think we should all do that. And a very quick point, Ali, to tie this up with the corporate world. Of course, part of this is to understand the responsibilities, and the discussion around Facebook, or I'm not really sure what it's called, Mega yet. And the responsibilities are part of this, and of course, Twitter and so on and so forth. Visibility matters. Visibility is important. And in this sense, I think that part of the corporate world is understanding as well the fact that these communities, populations, and peoples that we're talking about in this work are not monolithic. And to put it quite bluntly, just because you get a bunch of white, urban, gay men of the global North into a boardroom, that doesn't necessarily create diversity of views that may actually end up perpetuating views that we are questioning. And I think that's part of the importance of acknowledging the responsibilities of diversity within the corporate world.
Thank you. And Julia, did you want to speak?
Yes, I wanted to speak on the social media, but maybe one sentence to add to what Melissa has said on the corporates. I think corporates, in particular, the global corporates as well have a responsibility to lead by example, to not reproduce patterns of power, in particular when it comes to gender and global North, global South dynamics within their own realm, and as well to create safe spaces for their employees. Melissa has already mentioned that, to provide to provide resources and support for possible or actual victims of violence, but that could as well be extended to providing safe spaces for LGBTI people, in particular in states where it is not safe to be LGBTI. That's what I wanted to say to the corporates. And coming to the social media question, I think the question around social media and the high visibility of the loud and opposing voices cannot be answered separately from looking at economic interests, because at the end of the day, all these social media platforms have an economic interest. And I mean, it's a well-proven fact that radical opinions give more clicks and hence translate to more financial income for these platforms. And I think that cannot be, and that's a problem in itself. And it can't be like separated from the question on how to address those. And I think there is an obligation both for the corporates that run these social media platforms, but as well for lawmakers to provide the legal frames that require those corporates to act within certain boundaries and to have enough resources in order to remove those very hostile and sometimes violence inciting posts.
And I know we're running very close to the end, and so there are questions. Obviously, there's so much to say, and I think it's important to maybe build in some of the questions that have come through that we can't address. The question of more visibilization of trans men and boys and the ways in which their presence, their needs, their desires have not yet been fully addressed in many settings. The link between social media, reprisals, gender ideology, and democracy. These are all the questions that I think we are, as I said at the beginning, that Victor invited us to join in discussion on, to use the gender and human rights lens to make visible these questions of power. And I think the work is large, but I would say certainly from the work done by our panelists and by Victor and from the many of you watching, it is work that we are capable of doing. And I want to thank all the panelists. Unfortunately, we can't handle all the questions. We will, I think Victor will pay attention to them. We'll see as we follow up. Please go to the channel on the mandates channels, which should be visible soon on our screen, so we can follow up with this dialogue in regard to the questions that we weren't able to answer. And I do need to end us here with a great thanks, an incredible thanks, both to Victor, our panelists, but also particularly to our hosts at the Harvard Law School Human Rights Program and our colleagues who supported us with technology and translation at the Egide Alliance and the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. And unfortunately, with that, I have to bring us to a close, but with, again, incredible gratitude for Victor for, in that way, with this comprehensive thinking and work, bringing us all together. Thank you.